At 76, Reema Jones had sacrificed everything for her granddaughter Sarah, working multiple jobs, postponing retirement, giving unconditional love for 20 years. When Sarah suddenly inherited $60 million from an estranged grandfather, Reema thought their struggles were finally over. Instead, Sarah cruelly evicted her from their new mansion, choosing wealth and social status over family. But within a week, Sarah's fortune crumbled through fraud and betrayal. Her fair-weather friends vanished, and she faced losing everything. Now she stood crying at Reema's door, learning that some things money can't buy back. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm clock's drill cry pierced the pre-dawn silence at 5:30 a.m. just as it had every weekday morning for the past 3 years. Reema Jones silenced it quickly, her weathered fingers moving with practice efficiency to avoid waking her granddaughter. At 76, she moved more slowly than she once did, but her routine remained unchanged. Up before sunrise, shower, coffee, and out the door to her part-time job at Martinez Alterations before most people her age were even stirring. The tiny apartment they shared bore the weight of decades of careful living. Every piece of furniture had been bought second-hand and meticulously maintained. The couch, reupholstered twice by Reema's own hands, sat beneath a window overlooking the parking lot of their modest complex. Family photos lined the narrow hallway. Sarah's graduation from high school, her college ceremony, and most recently her MBA graduation just 6 months ago. Each frame had been chosen for practicality rather than beauty, but Reema had positioned them to catch the morning light. As Reema prepared her simple breakfast of toast and instant coffee, she could hear Sarah's laptop humming from the bedroom they'd converted into a makeshift office. Her granddaughter had been up late again, scouring job websites and polishing her resume for what felt like the 100th time. The sound of furious typing had lasted well past midnight, punctuated by occasional sighs of frustration that made her heart ache. "Sarah, honey, I'm heading out," Reema called softly, adjusting the lightweight cardigan that would have to suffice as a coat despite the October chill. "There's leftover soup in the fridge for lunch." Came the distracted response from behind the closed door. Reema paused, considering whether to say more. She wanted to tell Sarah that everything would work out, that her intelligence and education would eventually open the right door. But she had learned to choose her words carefully these days. Her granddaughter had grown increasingly sensitive about what she called empty platitudes and outdated advice from someone who doesn't understand today's job market. The 20-minute bus ride to the alteration shop gave Reema time to think, something she both welcomed and dreaded. The familiar weight of worry settled in her chest as she watched the city wake up around her. She worried about Sarah's growing bitterness, about the way her bright, ambitious granddaughter seemed to be hardening against the world and against her. Most of all, she worried about the small but growing distance between them, a chasm that seemed to widen with each passing day of unemployment and disappointment. When Reema returned home that evening, her fingers stiff from 8 hours of precise needlework, she found Sarah exactly where she had left her, hunched over her laptop at the small kitchen table they'd used as a desk. The day's mail sat unopened beside her, and the soup Reema had mentioned remained untouched in the refrigerator. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Reema asked, setting down her purse and immediately moving to the kitchen to start dinner. "Just fantastic. 3 more rejection emails. Apparently, I'm either overqualified for entry-level positions or underexperienced for anything that would actually use my education." She gestured at her laptop screen with bitter sarcasm. "This one's particularly rich. They want 5 years of experience for a junior analyst position." Her heart clenched at the defeat in her granddaughter's voice. "You know, dear, when I was your age, when you were my age, Grandma, you could walk into an office with a high school diploma and get hired on the spot. The world doesn't work that way anymore. Everything requires experience you can't get without a job you can't get without experience." The familiar tension settled between them like a heavy blanket. Reema busied herself with preparing dinner, choosing her words carefully. "I just meant that sometimes opportunities come from unexpected places. Maybe you could consider starting somewhere smaller, building connections. Connections. Sarah's voice rolled slightly as she finally turned to face her grandmother. What connections do I have? You think any of my classmates are going to help me get into their daddy's companies? You think the people I went to school with even remember I exist now that we're all broke students together? The words hung in the air between them, sharp with unspoken resentment. Reema saw her granddaughter's frustration. But she also saw something else. Shame. Shame about their modest circumstances. About sharing a cramped apartment with their elderly grandmother. About wearing interview clothes from discount stores while competing against candidates who could afford designer suits. Sarah, there's nothing wrong with what? With you still working at 76 because my degree is apparently worthless. With living in a place where Mrs. Rodriguez next door has to help us carry groceries up the stairs. With watching you count quarters to make sure we have enough for the electric bill. Reema's patience, worn thin by decades of sacrifice and months of walking on eggshells, finally frayed. I work because I want to contribute, not because I have to. And there's no shame in any of this. Sarah Williams. We have a roof over our heads, food on the table and each other. That's more than many people have. That's easy to say when you've never wanted more than this. Sarah muttered, turning back to her laptop. The words hit Reema like a physical blow. Never wanted more. She thought of the dream she had set aside when Sarah's parents died. The retirement she had postponed indefinitely. The small luxury she'd foregone to pay for tutoring and textbooks and college applications. But she swallowed her hurt, as she always did, and continued preparing their simple dinner in silence. The phone rang at 7:30 p.m., cutting through the oppressive quiet that had settled over their apartment. Sarah glanced at the caller ID and frowned. Morrison Hartley and Associates, probably debt collectors. Wanna bet they're calling about my student loans. But something about the name nagged at Reema. Morrison. She'd heard that name before, though she couldn't place where. Maybe you should answer it, she suggested gently. Sarah reluctantly picked up the phone. Her voice carefully professional. Hello. Reema watched her granddaughter's expression shift from weary defensiveness to confusion, then to something approaching shock. The conversation was brief, mostly Sarah saying yes and I understand and asking for the address to be repeated. When she hung up, she stared at the phone for a long moment. What was it, dear? Reema asked, though something in her chest had tightened with inexplicable anxiety. That was a lawyer, Elena Morrison. She says she needs to meet with me about family matters. Sarah's voice carried a note of bewilderment. She wants to see me tomorrow at her office downtown. Something about an estate. Reema felt the blood drain from her face. Estate matters could only mean one thing. Someone in their small family had died. But who? Sarah's father had been an only child as far as she knew. And Sarah's mother's family had cut ties years ago. Did she say whose estate it was? Reema asked carefully. No, just that it was urgent and involved me directly. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then her expression darkened with familiar cynicism. It's probably some kind of scam. Or maybe someone with the same name died and left debts we'll somehow be responsible for. That would be our just luck. But Reema couldn't shake the feeling that this phone call was going to change everything. She had learned to trust her instincts over the years. And right now, every instinct she had was screaming that their quiet, careful life was about to be turned upside down. As they ate their simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, neither woman spoke much. Sarah seemed lost in thought, while Reema found herself studying her granddaughter's face, memorizing the concentrated furrow of her brow, the way she absently tucked her hair behind her ear when thinking. Tomorrow, Sarah would walk into that lawyer's office and learn something that would shift the foundation of their world. She could feel it as surely as she could feel the approaching storm in her arthritic joints. What she couldn't know is that within 24 hours, the granddaughter she had raised and loved and sacrificed everything for would begin to see her not as family, but as an obstacle to overcome. The law offices of Morrison Hartley and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown tower that made Sarah feel underdressed despite her best interview suit. The marble lobby with its soaring ceiling and abstract sculptures whispered of old money and serious business. Sarah's heels clicked nervously against the polished floor as she approached the reception desk, acutely aware that her entire outfit probably costs less than the receptionist handbag. "Sarah Williams to see Elena Morrison," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The receptionist, a poised woman in her 30s with perfectly styled hair, smiled professionally. "Of course, Miss Williams. Miss Morrison is expecting you." 32nd floor corner office. The elevator ride seemed to last forever, each floor ticking by like a countdown to something she couldn't name. When the doors opened, she found herself in a hallway lined with mahogany paneling and oil paintings that looked older than the building itself. Elena Morrison's office sat at the end of the corridor, its double doors bearing a brass nameplate that gleamed under the soft lighting. Elena Morrison was not what Sarah had expected. The woman who rose from behind the imposing desk was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and sharp gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her handshake was firm, her smile measured. "Ms. Williams, thank you for coming on such short notice. Please have a seat." Sarah settled into one of the leather chairs facing the desk, her eyes taking in the wall of law books, the diplomas from Harvard and Yale, the subtle indicators of serious wealth and influence that filled the room. "I have to admit, Ms. Morrison, I'm completely puzzled about why I'm here. When you mentioned family matters, I couldn't think of any relatives who might have." Sarah paused. The word died sticking in her throat. Elena's expression softened slightly. "Ms. Williams, what I'm about to tell you may come as quite a shock. Are you familiar with the name Richard Blackwood?" Sarah frowned, searching her memory. "I don't think so. Should I be?" "Richard Blackwood was your grandfather, your father's father." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "That's impossible. My father never mentioned his parents. We assumed they had died when he was young." Elena opened a thick file on her desk, removing several documents. "Your grandfather was very much alive until 3 weeks ago. He was the founder and CEO of Blackwood Properties, one of the largest real estate development companies on the East Coast. His estate is valued at approximately $400 million. Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. $400 million. But why didn't we know about him? Why wasn't he in our lives? Elena's expression grew carefully neutral. There was a family estrangement. Your grandfather disapproved of your father's marriage to your mother. He felt that your father was marrying beneath his social station. When your father refused to end the relationship, Richard cut off all contact and financial support. The revelation hit Sarah in waves. Her father, who had struggled as a middle school teacher his entire life, had been the son of a billionaire. Her family had lived modestly, counting pennies while a fortune sat just out of reach. So he disowned my father completely. Your grandfather was a man of firm convictions, though I believe he came to regret his decision in later years. He hired private investigators to keep track of your father's life, but maintained no direct contact. When your parents died in that car accident when you were 8, he knew about it, but respected your grandmother's decision to raise you herself." Sarah's mind reeled. "He knew about me. All these years he knew I existed." "He did. And when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer 6 months ago, he made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. He changed his will." Elena removed another document from the file. "Ms. Williams, your grandfather has left you $60 million. The number hung in the air between them like something tangible. Sarah's mouth dried, and she gripped the arms of her chair to steady herself. $60 million. The inheritance comes with certain conditions and requirements, which we'll discuss in detail once you've had time to process this information. But yes, you are now a very wealthy woman." Sarah stared at the document Elena had placed before her, trying to make sense of the legal language. The number seemed surreal, impossible. "Why? Why now? Why me?" "Your grandfather believed in redemption, Miss Williams. He spent his final months researching your life, learning about your education, your character. He was impressed by your academic achievements and your modest circumstances. He saw it as an opportunity to right an old wrong. Something in Elena's tone made Sarah look up sharply. You said there were conditions. Standard estate requirements. Nothing that should concern someone of good character. Elena's smile was perfectly professional, but Sarah sensed something being held back. For now, let's focus on the practical matters. I can arrange for an immediate transfer of $1 million to your account as an advance against the inheritance. The rest will be transferred once all legal requirements are met. $1 million. Sarah's mind struggled to process the concept. Yesterday, she had been counting quarters for the electric bill. Today, she was being offered more money than she had ever imagined possessing. I need you to sign some initial paperwork. Nothing binding. Just acknowledgement that you've been informed of the inheritance and agreed to proceed with the legal process. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she signed her name. The moment the pen left the paper, something shifted inside her. The shabby interview suit she wore suddenly felt like a costume from a past life she was already eager to leave behind. Ms. Williams, I should mention that your newfound wealth will likely attract attention. I strongly advise discretion in how you handle this transition. Sudden wealth can be challenging to navigate. But Sarah barely heard the warning. Her mind was racing ahead, calculating, imagining. No more rejection letters. No more watching Reema count coins. No more shame about their modest apartment or second-hand furniture. She could finally live the life she had always believed she deserved. When will the money be available? She asked. The advance can be transferred today. I'll have my assistant handle the paperwork. Alina's gray eyes studied Sarah carefully. Ms. Williams, if I may offer some advice. Wealth of this magnitude comes with responsibilities. I hope you'll remember the people who supported you during more difficult times. Sarah nodded absently, but her attention was already elsewhere. She was thinking about designer clothes, about a proper apartment, about finally being able to hold her head high among her former classmates. The warning about remembering people from difficult times seemed quaint, almost patronizing. Of course she would take care of Reema. They would both benefit from this windfall. As she left the law office, Sarah felt as though she was walking through a dream. The city looked different somehow, more vibrant and full of possibility. The homeless man she passed on the corner, whom she usually acknowledged with a sympathetic nod, barely registered in her peripheral vision. The discount store where she had bought her interview clothes seemed like a relic from another lifetime. Her first stop was Nordstrom, where she purchased a dress that cost more than Reema's monthly income. The saleswoman treated her with deference that felt intoxicating, and Sarah found herself adding shoes, a handbag, and jewelry to her purchases without checking prices. When the total reached $3,000, she felt a momentary flutter of panic, then remembered that she was now worth $60 million. That evening, she dined alone at the city's most exclusive restaurant, ordering wine that cost more per glass than their usual weekly grocery budget. The waitstaff's attentiveness, the other diners' approving glances at her expensive new dress, the simple pleasure of not worrying about the cost, it all felt like a drug in her bloodstream. As she sat in the restaurant's elegant dining room, Sarah began to understand something that had eluded her during years of financial struggle. Money wasn't just about security or comfort. It was about respect, about belonging, about finally being seen as worthy of attention and consideration. For the first time in her adult life, she felt truly powerful. The idea of returning to the cramped apartment she shared with Reema suddenly seemed intolerable. Tomorrow, she would start looking for a proper home, something befitting her new status. They would move somewhere elegant, somewhere that reflected who she was meant to be. But even as she made these plans, a small voice in the back of her mind wondered why Elena Morrison had seemed so cautious, so careful in her warnings. What conditions could there be on an inheritance? What requirements might challenge someone of good character? Sarah pushed the questions aside. Whatever the conditions were, they couldn't be too difficult. She was educated, intelligent, deserving of this reversal of fortune. After years of struggle and disappointment, the universe was finally giving her what she had earned. As she signed the check for her expensive dinner without even glancing at the total, Sarah Williams felt truly free for the first time in her life. Tomorrow she would share her good fortune with Reema, and they would begin their new life together. She had no idea by the end of the week she would discover that some gifts come with a price too high to pay. Sarah arrived home after midnight, her designer shopping bags rustling in the quiet hallway. The contrast between the luxury items she carried and the worn carpet of their apartment complex struck her with fresh force. Everything about their building, from the flickering fluorescent lights to the thin walls that allowed Mrs. Rodriguez's television to bleed through, suddenly seemed intolerable. She found Reema waiting up in the living room, still wearing the clothes she'd worked in that day, a cup of tea growing cold on the side table beside her. "Sarah, honey, you've been gone for hours. I was getting worried." Reema's eyes took in the shopping bags, the expensive dress, the newfound confidence in her granddaughter's posture. "What happened at the lawyer's office?" Sarah set down her bags with deliberate ceremony, savoring the moment. "Grandma, you're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you. We're rich. Incredibly, impossibly rich." She launched into the story of Richard Blackwood, the inheritance, the $60 million, speaking faster as excitement built in her voice. But as she talked, she watched Reema's expression shift from amazement to something more complicated. Concern mixed with a weariness that irritated Sarah more than she expected. $60 million, Reema repeated slowly as if testing the words. "And this grandfather of yours? He just appeared out of nowhere after. What purpose? What people? Mrs. Martinez pays you minimum wage to fix other people's clothes. You could be doing so much more with your time." "Like," Sarah gestured vaguely. "I don't know. Travel, take classes, volunteer somewhere meaningful. I do volunteer at the food bank every Saturday, remember? And I find meaning in helping people afford to keep their clothes in good repair." The simple dignity in Reema's response made Sarah feel somehow smaller, and that feeling transformed into resentment. Why did Reema always have to make her feel guilty for wanting more? Why couldn't she understand that they had the opportunity to rise above their circumstances? "That's fine for now," Sarah said dismissively. "But once we move to a better neighborhood, you'll need to find activities that fit our new situation." Reema sat down her sewing and looked at her granddaughter with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "And what situation is that exactly?" "The situation of people who matter, Grandma. People who have influence and resources and connections. People who can make a difference in the world instead of just getting by." The words came out harsher than Sarah intended, but she didn't take them back. She was tired of apologizing for wanting more. Tired of pretending that their small life was enough when she finally had the means to claim something bigger. As she headed to her room, leaving Reema alone with her mending, Sarah felt a mixture of liberation and unease. Change was never comfortable, she told herself. Growing into her new life meant leaving behind the limitations of her old one. And if that caused some temporary friction with Reema, it was a price worth paying. Tomorrow, she would start looking for houses with Marcus' help. Real houses in neighborhoods where people like Jasmine lived, where Sarah Williams could finally become the person she was meant to be. The fact that this person seemed increasingly distant from the granddaughter who had once cherished quiet evenings with Reema didn't occur to her. Or if it did, she pushed the thought away as a remnant of the small thinking that had kept her trapped for so long. The house in Riverside Heights was everything Sarah had dreamed of. A Tudor revival with leaded glass windows, manicured gardens, and the kind of quiet elegance that whispered of old money and social standing. The real estate agent who had barely acknowledged Sarah's existence 2 weeks ago now treated her with obsequious deference, having been informed by Marcus Webb of her significant financial position. The previous owners were the Ashfords. He was a federal judge. She was on the boards of several cultural institutions. Very respected family. "I think you'll find the home has that kind of refined atmosphere." Sarah walked through the rooms with growing excitement, imagining herself hosting dinner parties in the formal dining room, entertaining Jasmine and her circle in the spacious living room with its stone fireplace. The master suite was larger than their entire current apartment, with a walk-in closet that could house her expanding wardrobe and a bathroom that belonged in a luxury hotel. Reema, who had reluctantly agreed to see the house, followed quietly behind, her weathered hands touching surfaces as if testing their reality. Sarah watched her grandmother take in the opulent details, the chandelier in the entryway, the hardwood floors that gleamed under professional lighting, and the kitchen with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. "It's certainly beautiful," Reema said carefully when the agent asked for her opinion. "Very grand." I heard reservation in her grandmother's tone and felt the familiar irritation rise. "Grand is the point, Grandma. We can finally live somewhere worthy of who we are. The asking price is $3.2 million, though I believe we can negotiate given the current market conditions." $3.2 million. Sarah did quick mental math. Barely 5% of her inheritance for a house that represented everything she had ever wanted. "We'll take it," she said, ignoring Reema's sharp intake of breath. Within a week, the papers were signed and they were moving in. Sarah hired professional movers, partly for efficiency, but mostly for the pleasure of watching strangers handle their modest possessions with careful respect. Their old furniture looked shabby and inadequate in the new space that Sarah was already planning to replace everything with pieces worthy of their new address. Reema seemed lost in the large house, moving through rooms like a guest unsure of his welcome. She set up her sewing machine in a corner of what Sarah called the morning room. Though Sarah had made it clear that visible work activities weren't really appropriate for public spaces. "Marcus and Jasmine are coming over tonight," Sarah announced as she arranged flowers in the dining room. An arrangement that had cost more than their weekly grocery budget used to be. "What we've done." Reema looked up from unpacking books in the library. "I haven't done anything, Sarah. This is your house, your money, your new life." "It's our new life," Sarah said impatiently. "You're part of this too. You just need to adjust your thinking." Marcus arrived precisely on time. His BMW pulling into our circular driveway as if he belonged there. Jasmine came separately in a sleek convertible, dressed as if for a magazine photo shoot. I felt a surge of pride as I welcomed them into my home. My home with its gleaming surfaces and perfect proportions. "Sarah, darling, this is absolutely divine," Jasmine gushed, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "You have such exquisite taste. It's exactly what I would have chosen." Marcus nodded approvingly as he examined the living room. "Excellent investment. Property in this neighborhood only appreciates. You've chosen wisely." I glowed under their praise, feeling validated in ways I had never experienced. This was what I had been missing. Recognition from people who understood quality, who could appreciate what I had accomplished. When Reema appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of coffee and homemade cookies, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Jasmine's smile became more fixed, and Marcus' attention seemed to drift. I felt embarrassment flush through me, not for Reema herself, but for how Reema looked in this context. A 76-year-old woman in a cardigan and sensible shoes carrying a tray like hired help in what was supposed to be her granddaughter's sophisticated home. "How sweet," Jasmine said with practiced politeness. "A homemade cookies. How nostalgic." The pause before nostalgic carried volumes. I heard the subtle discontention. Saw how Jasmine's eyes took in Reema's appearance with barely concealed disdain. Marcus simply ignored Reema entirely, continuing his conversation about investment opportunities as if she hadn't entered the room. "Grandmother, you didn't need to serve us," I said quickly. "We could have managed ourselves." "I wanted to be helpful," Reema replied quietly, setting the tray down and retreating toward the kitchen. After she left, Jasmine leaned closer to Sarah. "She's very sweet, of course. But darling, you do realize that when you start entertaining seriously board members, investors, social connections, you'll need to think about presentation." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "Well, I mean that people at AA level expect a certain atmosphere, professional staff, appropriate settings. Your grandmother is lovely, I'm sure, but she does rather give the impression of your previous circumstances." Marcus nodded without looking up from his phone. "Optics matter in wealth management, Sarah. The right image opens doors. The wrong image closes them." "But she's family," Sarah said weakly. "Of course she is, and family is precious. But that doesn't mean she needs to be visible during important social occasions." Many wealthy families maintained separate living arrangements. A nice apartment in a good building, close enough for regular visits, but private enough for everyone's comfort. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Send Reema away after everything they'd been through together. I couldn't do that. She raised me. She sacrificed everything for me. And now you can repay that sacrifice by ensuring her comfort in her golden years. A beautiful apartment, full-time care if needed, financial security. What more could an elderly woman want? Sarah found herself nodding along despite the churning in her stomach. When phrased that way, it did sound generous, considerate, even. Reema would be comfortable, safer in a building with proper security and medical services nearby. And Sarah would be free to build her new life without constantly worrying about whether her grandmother fit in. Over the following days, the idea took root in her mind. She began noticing things she had previously ignored. How Reema's presence seemed to diminish her authority when service people came to the house. How her grandmother's simple clothes and habits stood out starkly against our new surroundings. When Jasmine invited her to join the Junior League Auxiliary, mentioning that members were expected to host events in their homes, she could only think about how impossible that would be with Reema padding around in her slippers. The conversation she had been dreading came on a Tuesday evening as they sat in the formal dining room eating takeout Chinese food from paper containers. A compromise that somehow felt wrong in their elegant new setting. "Grandma, I've been thinking about our situation here," Sarah began carefully. "What about it? This house is very large for 2 people. And with my new social obligations, entertaining responsibilities, I think it might be better if you had your own place. Somewhere more suited to your needs." The FK slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate. "My own place. A beautiful apartment, Grandma? Somewhere safe and comfortable with everything you need. You'd have complete independence, and I could visit." Barely acknowledged Sarah's existence 2 weeks ago, now treated her with obsequious deference, having been informed by Marcus Webb of her significant financial position. The previous owners were the Ashfords. He was a federal judge. She was on the boards of several cultural institutions. Very respected family. "I think you'll find the home has that kind of refined atmosphere." Sarah walked through the rooms with growing excitement, imagining herself hosting dinner parties in the formal dining room, entertaining Jasmine and her circle in the spacious living room with its stone fireplace. The master suite was larger than their entire current apartment, with a walk-in closet that could house her expanding wardrobe and a bathroom that belonged in a luxury hotel. Reema, who had reluctantly agreed to see the house, followed quietly behind, her weathered hands touching surfaces as if testing their reality. Sarah watched her grandmother take in the opulent details, the chandelier in the entryway, the hardwood floors that gleamed under professional lighting, and the kitchen with its granite countertops and professional-grade appliances. "It's certainly beautiful," Reema said carefully when the agent asked for her opinion. "Very grand." I heard reservation in her grandmother's tone and felt the familiar irritation rise. "Grand is the point, Grandma. We can finally live somewhere worthy of who we are. The asking price is $3.2 million. Though I believe we can negotiate given the current market conditions." $3.2 million. Sarah did quick mental math. Barely 5% of her inheritance for a house that represented everything she had ever wanted. "We'll take it," she said, ignoring Reema's sharp intake of breath. Within a week, the papers were signed and they were moving in. Sarah hired professional movers, partly for efficiency, but mostly for the pleasure of watching strangers handle their modest possessions with careful respect. Their old furniture looked shabby and inadequate in the new space that Sarah was already planning to replace everything with pieces worthy of their new address. Reema seemed lost in the large house, moving through rooms like a guest unsure of his welcome. She set up her sewing machine in a corner of what Sarah called the morning room. Though Sarah had made it clear that visible work activities weren't really appropriate for public spaces. "Marcus and Jasmine are coming over tonight," Sarah announced as she arranged flowers in the dining room. An arrangement that had cost more than their weekly grocery budget used to be. "What we've done." Reema looked up from unpacking books in the library. "I haven't done anything, Sarah. This is your house, your money, your new life." "It's our new life," Sarah said impatiently. You're part of this too. You just need to adjust your thinking. Marcus arrived precisely on time. His BMW pulling into our circular driveway as if he belonged there. Jasmine came separately in a sleek convertible, dressed as if for a magazine photo shoot. I felt a surge of pride as I welcomed them into my home. My home with its gleaming surfaces and perfect proportions. Sarah, darling, this is absolutely divine. Jasmine gushed, her heels clicking on the marble floor. You have such exquisite taste. It's exactly what I would have chosen. Marcus nodded approvingly as he examined the living room. Excellent investment. Property in this neighborhood only appreciates. You've chosen wisely. I glowed under their praise, feeling validated in ways I had never experienced. This was what I had been missing. Recognition from people who understood quality, who could appreciate what I had accomplished. When Reema appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of coffee and homemade cookies, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Jasmine's smile became more fixed, and Marcus' attention seemed to drift. I felt embarrassment flush through me, not for Reema herself, but for how Reema looked in this context. A 76-year-old woman in a cardigan and sensible shoes carrying a tray like hired help in what was supposed to be her granddaughter's sophisticated home. How sweet, Jasmine said with practiced politeness. A homemade cookies. How nostalgic. The pause before nostalgic carried volumes. I heard the subtle discontention. Saw how Jasmine's eyes took in Reema's appearance with barely concealed disdain. Marcus simply ignored Reema entirely, continuing his conversation about investment opportunities as if she hadn't entered the room. Grandmother, you didn't need to serve us, I said quickly. We could have managed ourselves. I wanted to be helpful, Reema replied quietly, setting the tray down and retreating toward the kitchen. After she left, Jasmine leaned closer to Sarah. She's very sweet, of course. But darling, you do realize that when you start entertaining seriously board members, investors, social connections, you'll need to think about presentation. Sarah's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Well, I mean that people at AA level expect a certain atmosphere, professional staff, appropriate settings. Your grandmother is lovely, I'm sure, but she does rather give the impression of your previous circumstances. Marcus nodded without looking up from his phone. Optics matter in wealth management, Sarah. The right image opens doors. The wrong image closes them. But she's family, Sarah said weakly. Of course she is, and family is precious. But that doesn't mean she needs to be visible during important social occasions. Many wealthy families maintain separate living arrangements. A nice apartment in a good building, close enough for regular visits, but private enough for everyone's comfort. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Send Reema away after everything they'd been through together. I couldn't do that. She raised me. She sacrificed everything for me. And now you can repay that sacrifice by ensuring her comfort in her golden years. A beautiful apartment, full-time care if needed, financial security. What more could an elderly woman want? Sarah found herself nodding along despite the churning in her stomach. When phrased that way, it did sound generous, considerate, even. Reema would be comfortable, safer in a building with proper security and medical services nearby. And Sarah would be free to build her new life without constantly worrying about whether her grandmother fit in. Over the following days, the idea took root in her mind. She began noticing things she had previously ignored. How Reema's presence seemed to diminish her authority when service people came to the house. How her grandmother's simple clothes and habits stood out starkly against our new surroundings. When Jasmine invited her to join the Junior League Auxiliary, mentioning that members were expected to host events in their homes, she could only think about how impossible that would be with Reema padding around in her slippers. The conversation she had been dreading came on a Tuesday evening as they sat in the formal dining room eating takeout Chinese food from paper containers. A compromise that somehow felt wrong in their elegant new setting. Grandma, I've been thinking about our situation here, Sarah began carefully. What about it? This house is very large for two people. And with my new social obligations, entertaining responsibilities, I think it might be better if you had your own place, somewhere more suited to your needs. The FK slipped from her fingers, clattering against her plate. My own place. A beautiful apartment, Grandma? Somewhere safe and comfortable with everything you need. You'd have complete independence, and I could visit regularly. You want me to leave? It wasn't a question. I want what's best for both of us. You've never been comfortable here. I can see that you'd be happier somewhere smaller, somewhere that feels more like home to you. Reema's voice was very quiet. This is supposed to be my home. Sarah, you said we were building a new life together. We are just separately. Grandma, you have to understand the people I'm meeting now, the opportunities that are opening up. They require a certain kind of lifestyle. I need to be when Mrs. Rodriguez arrived the next morning to help Reema pack her few belongings. Sarah stayed in her room, listening to the quiet sounds of her grandmother's life being reduced to boxes small enough for a one-bedroom apartment. She told herself this was temporary, that once she was established in her new world, she would bring Reema back. Telling and preparing the story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as she watched from her bedroom window while Mrs. Rodriguez helped Reema into a taxi with her suitcases, Sarah Williams knew she had just crossed a line she could never uncross. The woman who had raised her, who had sacrificed her own comfort and dreams for Sarah's future, was disappearing down the driveway like a visitor whose welcome had expired. For a moment, Sarah's reflection in the window looked like a stranger, someone harder, colder, more calculating than the granddaughter who had once cherished quiet evenings with Reema. But she pushed the thought away. Change was never easy. Growing into her true self meant leaving behind the limitations of her past, even if those limitations had loved her unconditionally for 20 years. With Reema gone, the house in Riverside Heights felt different. Larger, more elegant, but also strangely hollow. Sarah told herself the emptiness was simply space waiting to be filled with the right kind of life, the kind she was finally free to build. She threw herself into that project with the fervor of someone proving a point to an invisible audience. The housewarming party she hosted 2 weeks later was everything she had imagined it could be. Caterers in crisp white uniforms served champagne and canopies while a string quartet played softly in the background. Jasmine had helped with the guest list, ensuring the right mix of social influencers, arts patrons, and successful professionals. Sarah wore a black cocktail dress that cost more than Reema's monthly income and felt for the first time in her adult life truly sophisticated. "You've created something magical here," gushed Patricia Whitman, the president of the Children's Museum Board. "The bones of this house are exquisite, and you filled it with such elegant taste." Sarah glowed under the praise, moving through her home with practiced grace, accepting compliments on her wine selection, her interior decorator's choices, her obvious refinement. Marcus worked the room like a conductor, introducing her to potential business contacts, and dropping hints about lucrative investment opportunities. Sarah's been very aggressive with her portfolio diversification. He told a real estate developer over single malt scotch. She understands that wealth isn't built by sitting on cash. It's built by recognizing opportunities others miss. The investment opportunities Marcus presented seemed to multiply weekly. A resort development in Costa Rica that promised 30% returns. A tech startup developing revolutionary renewable energy solutions. A private equity firm specializing in distressed properties that could be flipped for enormous profits. The key is getting in early before the market recognizes value. Marcus explained during one of their regular strategy sessions. Your grandfather understood this principle. That's how he built his empire. Sarah found herself signing documents and authorizing transfers with increasing frequency. $5 million for the Costa Rica project, $8 million for the renewable energy startup, $12 million for a shopping center redevelopment that Marcus insisted was practically guaranteed money. Each investment came with compelling presentations, detailed projections, and the intoxicating sense that she was playing in the same league as serious wealth builders. When she hesitated over the size of the commitments, Marcus would remind her that conservative thinking was poverty thinking. He would say, "Wealthy people understand that money is a tool, not a treasure to be hoarded. Your inheritance is just the beginning. The question is whether you'll have the vision to multiply it." Jasmine, meanwhile, expanded Sarah's social obligations with breathtaking efficiency. The Junior League Auxiliary led to the Symphony Guild, which led to the Art Museum's Patron Circle, which led to the Historical Society's Preservation Committee. Each organization required not just membership fees, but substantial donations, charity auction purchases, and hosting responsibilities. "Visibility is everything in our circle," Jasmine explained as they planned Sarah's involvement in the annual arts gala. Sarah found herself writing checks for amounts that would have seemed fantastical months earlier. $20,000 for a table at the Children's Hospital benefit. $50,000 for naming rights to a museum gallery. $75,000 for a silent option bid on a week in a Tuscan villa, not because she particularly wanted the vacation, but because Jasmine assured her it would send the right message about your priorities. The social whirlwind left little time for reflection, which Sarah told herself was exactly what she needed. She was building something important. Not just wealth but influence, recognition, a place in the world that mattered. When fleeting thoughts of Reema surfaced, she pushed them away with reminders that her grandmother was comfortable in her new apartment, that their separation was temporary, that Sarah needed to establish herself before she could properly care for anyone else. The first warning sign came during a phone call from Elena Morrison on a Tuesday morning in November. "Miss Williams, I wanted to check in regarding your progress with the family obligations outlined in your grandfather's will," Elena said without preamble. Sarah, who had been reviewing Marcus' latest investment proposal, felt a chill of apprehension. "Family obligations. I thought we covered all the legal requirements." "The morality clause, Miss Williams. Surely you remember our discussion about demonstrating family values and humility in your management of the inheritance." Sarah's mouth dried. She assumed the standard requirements were simple formalities, not active evaluations of her behavior. "I'm not sure I understand exactly what you mean. The will specifically requires that you demonstrate care for family members, particularly elderly relatives, and that you manage your inheritance with appropriate humility and social responsibility. I've been conducting the required 6-month evaluation, and I have some concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Elena's voice was carefully neutral. "I understand that your grandmother is no longer living with you. Can you explain the circumstances of that change?" Sarah's heart began to race. She wanted her own place. "I provided her with a beautiful apartment, security, everything she needs. She's much more comfortable now." "You see. And how often do you visit this apartment?" The question hung in the air. Sarah realized with growing horror that she hadn't visited Reema once since the move. She had been too busy with her new social obligations, too caught up in establishing her position in Jasmine's circle. "I've been very busy with important commitments," Sarah said weakly. "Mrs. Williams, the evaluation period concludes in 6 weeks. I strongly suggest you review the terms of the inheritance and consider how your current lifestyle aligns with your grandfather's intentions." After Elena hung up, Sarah sat staring at her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She called Marcus immediately, explaining the conversation with growing panic. "It's just lawyer talk," Marcus assured her. "These estate attorneys always include language like that to protect themselves legally. Just visit your grandmother a few times, maybe bring her some flowers, and everything will be fine." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Elena Morrison's call represented something more serious than Marcus was acknowledging. She tried to focus on her daily activities. A luncheon for the Literacy Foundation, a planning meeting for the winter charity ball. But anxiety gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. That evening her phone rang again. This time it was David Williams, her uncle, whose existence she had almost forgotten in the whirlwind of her new life. "Sarah, I'm calling about your grandmother," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Rodriguez contacted me. She's worried about Reema." Sarah felt defensive immediately. "Grandma's fine. She has a beautiful apartment, everything she needs. When was the last time you saw her?" The question hit like a physical blow. "I've been very busy." "Sarah, she's been in that apartment for a month, and according to Mrs. Rodriguez, you haven't visited once. Reema won't admit it, but she's heartbroken. She raised you for 20 years and now she's been discarded like an old piece of furniture." That's not fair, Sarah protested. But the words felt hollow. I provided for her. She's comfortable. Comfortable and abandoned. Do you have any idea what you've done to her? This woman sacrificed her own dreams, her own future to give you every opportunity you ever had. And this is how you repay her. David's anger was quiet but unmistakable. I've been watching our family from a distance for years, Sarah. I knew your grandfather knew what his pride and selfishness cost him. I hoped you'd be different. I am different. No, you're not. You're making the same choices he made, choosing status over love, image over family. And if you're not careful, you're going to end up just as alone as he did. The line made dead, leaving Sarah staring at her phone in the sudden silence of her too large house. For the first time since inheriting her fortune, Sarah felt genuinely afraid, not of losing money, but of something far more fundamental. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her elegant living room, she could see other houses in her expensive neighborhood, their windows glowing warmly against the November darkness. But despite all her wealth, all her careful social positioning, Sarah Williams had never felt more isolated. Somewhere across the city, in a modest apartment she had never visited, the woman who had loved her unconditionally for 20 years, was learning to live without the granddaughter she had raised. And Sarah was finally beginning to understand that some prices are too high to pay, even when you can afford them. As if Elena's revelation wasn't catastrophic enough, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Need to meet urgently. Problems with Costa Rica investment. The meeting with Marcus that afternoon revealed the second devastating blow. His usual confidence was replaced by barely controlled panic as he shuffled through documents in his downtown office. There's been a complication with the resort development, he said without meeting her eyes. The local government changed some environmental regulations. The project's been suspended indefinitely. Sarah felt her chest tighten. Suspended. What about our investment? These things happen in international development. The important thing is not to panic. I'm exploring recovery options. But as Marcus continued talking, Sarah noticed inconsistencies in his story, gaps that hadn't been there before. When she pressed for specifics about the other investments, the renewable energy startup, the shopping center development, his answers became increasingly vague. Marcus, I want to see actual documentation, bank statements, project updates, something concrete. His face flushed. Sarah, you're going to have to trust me here. These are complex financial instruments that require sophisticated understanding. Show me the documents. The silence stretched between them until Marcus finally spoke. His voice barely above a whisper. There may be some temporary liquidity issues across several investments. What kind of liquidity issues? The kind that require patience and faith in long-term returns. Sarah felt the last of her naive trust crumble. How much, Marcus? How much of my money is gone? It's not gone. It's temporarily inaccessible due to market conditions. How much? Marcus' shoulders sagged. Approximately $37 million. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. More than half her inheritance vanished into investments that were either fraudulent or catastrophically mismanaged. Sarah stumbled out of Marcus' office in a daze, her perfect new world collapsing around her like a house of cards. That evening, she tried calling Jasmine for support, for someone to help her process the magnitude of her situation. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. When Jasmine finally called back 3 hours later, her voice was cool, distant. Sarah, darling, I heard there might be some financial complications with your situation. I think it's best if we take a little break from our social commitments until things stabilize. Jasmine, I need help. I need someone to. I'm sorry, but I can't be associated with financial scandals, my reputation, my board positions. Surely you understand. The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone in her too large house with a crushing realization that everything she had built over the past months was as insubstantial as vapor. In desperation, she tried calling Reema, the woman she had abandoned for her hollow new life. But when she dialed the number for Sunset Manor, asking to be connected to her grandmother's apartment, she got only the answering machine. Reema's voice, dignified but distant, instructed callers to leave a message. Grandma, it's Sarah. I need to talk to you. I think I've made some terrible mistakes. Please call me back. But the phone never rang. 3 days later, Sarah stood in Elena Morrison's office again, this time as a supplicant rather than an heir. I want to make this right, she said, her voice barely steady. Tell me what I need to do to prove I've learned from my mistakes. Elena studied her for a long moment. Miss Williams, your grandfather included the morality clause because he believed people could change, could learn from adversity. But change requires more than just fear of consequences. It requires genuine transformation. I understand that now. Do you? Because my investigation suggests you haven't contacted your grandmother since learning about the inheritance review. That doesn't suggest genuine remorse. Suggests damage control. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. I was ashamed. I didn't know how to face her after what I'd done. Shame without action is just self-pity, Miss Williams. If you want to demonstrate genuine change, you need to start with genuine accountability. Elena handed her a card with an address. Your grandmother isn't at Sunset Manor anymore. She moved out last week. Mrs. Rodriguez helped her find a smaller apartment she could afford on her pension. Sarah stared at the address, her heart breaking. Even the beautiful apartment she had provided was beyond Reema's reach now, probably because Sarah had stopped paying for it in her financial chaos. How long do I have? The 6-month evaluation period ends in 10 days. After that, the inheritance reverts to various charities your grandfather designated. But Miss Williams, if your only motivation is preserving your wealth, you've already failed the most important test. That night, Sarah sat alone in her mansion, surrounded by expensive furniture and elegant artwork that felt like markers of her moral failure. Tomorrow, she would have to do something she had been too proud and too ashamed to do for weeks. She would have to face the woman who had loved her unconditionally, and admit that she had thrown away the most precious thing in her life for fool's gold and false friends. The question was whether Reema would even open the door. Sarah woke to her phone ringing at 6 a.m. The shrill sound cutting through the fog of her restless sleep. She fumbled for it, hoping desperately that it might be Reema returning her calls. Instead, it was her bank's fraud prevention department. Miss Williams, we're calling about some unusual activity on your accounts. We show several large wire transfers that don't match your typical patterns. We need to verify these transactions. Sarah's blood turned to ice as the representative read off transfer amounts. 2 million to an account in the Cayman Islands, 3 million to a Swiss bank, 5 million to what appears to be a shell company in Panama. All authorized with her electronic signature. All transferred within the last 48 hours. I didn't authorize any of these transfers, Sarah whispered. They all show proper authentication through your financial advisor's firm. A Mr. Marcus Webb has signatory authority on these accounts. Marcus Webb, who had disappeared without a trace. Sarah tried calling his office only to reach a disconnected number. She drove to his building downtown to find his suite empty, cleared out as if he had never existed. The security guard told her that the lease had been terminated the day before with no forwarding address. By noon, the full scope of the catastrophe was clear. Marcus had drained virtually every liquid asset she possessed, leaving her with less than $3 million from an inheritance that had once totaled $60 million. The investments he had guided her into were either completely fraudulent or had failed so spectacularly that recovery was impossible. Sarah's phone began ringing with calls from creditors, lawyers, and reporters who had somehow gotten the wind of the story. Aries loses fortune to financial fraud. Read the headline in the business section. Blackwood granddaughter falls victim to investment scam. The humiliation was crushing, but worse was the cascade of social rejection that followed. Jasmine's assistant called to inform Sarah that she was being removed from all committee positions due to the sensitive nature of recent developments. The Junior League Auxiliary sent a formal letter suggesting she take a temporary leave of absence from her memberships. One by one, the people who had courted her friendship and praised her generosity vanished like smoke. Invitations were rescinded, calls went unreturned, and Sarah found herself completely isolated in her expensive house that she could no longer afford to maintain. Elena Morrison's final call came on Friday afternoon. Miss Williams, I'm required to inform you that the Inheritance Review Committee has completed its evaluation. Based on your actions during the probationary period, we will be proceeding with full revocation of the bequest. Sarah's legs gave the address David had given her led to a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place Sarah had once been ashamed to visit even as a child. Now standing in the parking lot with rain beginning to fall, she felt nothing but shame for her own previous snobbery. The complex was clean, well-maintained, populated by families and elderly residents who took pride in their small community despite its humble circumstances. Sarah climbed the stairs to apartment 2B with legs that felt like lead. Each step felt like a mile, each breath like a struggle against the weight of her own guilt. She had rehearsed what to say during the drive over, but now all her carefully planned words felt inadequate, hollow. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if Reema refused to see her? What if the woman who had once loved her unconditionally had finally reached the limit of what that love could endure? Before she could lose her nerve completely, Sarah knocked softly. The door opened to reveal Mrs. Rodriguez, whose weathered face immediately hardened when she saw who stood in the hallway. "So, you finally decided to show up," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying decades of protective anger for her friend after months of letting her believe she meant nothing to you. "Mrs. Rodriguez, please. I need to see her. I need to tell her." "Tell her what?" "That you're sorry. That you finally remembered she exists. Do you have any idea what you've done to that woman?" Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I hurt her. I know I was wrong about everything. Please just let me try to Carmen." "Who is it?" Reema's voice came from inside the apartment, still carrying the gentle tone Sarah remembered from childhood. Mrs. Rodriguez looked back toward the living room. Then at Sarah, her expression torn between protectiveness and the knowledge that this conversation needed to happen. "It's Sarah," she called back. "She says she wants to talk to you." The silence that followed felt eternal. Sarah could hear the soft sound of Reema's slippers approaching the door, could sense her grandmother's presence just beyond the threshold. When Reema finally appeared beside Mrs. Rodriguez, Sarah's heart broke all over again. Reema looked smaller somehow, more fragile than Sarah remembered. Her clothes were clean but worn, her hair neatly styled, but showing more gray than before. But it was her eyes that destroyed Sarah. Still kind, still intelligent, but carrying a weariness that had never been there before, a guardedness that Sarah herself had created. "Hello, Sarah," Reema said quietly. "Grandma," Sarah's voice broke completely. "I'm so sorry for everything." Reema studied Sarah's face. The expensive clothes that couldn't hide her obvious distress. The perfectly styled hair that framed eyes red with crying. The manicured hands that shook as she wiped away tears. "You look tired," Reema said finally. "Come in." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped aside reluctantly, clearly wanting to protect her friend from further hurt. The apartment was small but immaculate, with the warm touches that made any space feel like home. Sarah recognized some of Reema's belongings. The small sewing box, the family photos, the Afghan she had crocheted years ago. "Sit down," Reema said, gesturing to the couch. "Carmen, would you mind giving us some privacy?" Mrs. Rodriguez kissed Reema's cheek. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything," she said pointedly, making it clear that Sarah was being watched and judged. Sarah perched on the couch, looking at her grandmother through tears that wouldn't stop falling. "Grandma, I destroyed everything. The inheritance is gone. The house is going to be foreclosed. My friends were never really my friends. And I hurt the only person who ever truly loved me." Reema settled carefully into the armchair across from her, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Tell me what happened, sweetheart." The endearment nearly undid Sarah completely. Even now, even after everything, Reema's first instinct was compassion. Sarah poured out the whole story. Marcus' betrayal, the failed investments, the morality clause, the social rejection, but most importantly, she talked about her own failures, her own choices. "I thought money would make me into someone better, someone worthy of respect, But it just turned me into someone I don't recognize. Someone who could throw away the most precious thing in my life for status and shallow friendships. Reema listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing of what she was thinking. When Sarah finally finished, the silence stretched between them like a chasm. "I failed you," Sarah whispered. "After everything you sacrificed for me, I failed you in the worst possible way." Reema was quiet for a long moment, her eyes studying Sarah's face with the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. "Do you know what hurt the most?" Reema asked, her voice very soft. "It wasn't being sent away from that beautiful house. It wasn't having to move to a smaller apartment or having to rely on Carmen's kindness. It was the way you looked at me that last day, like I was something embarrassing, something you needed to hide." Sarah flinched as if she'd been slapped. "Grandma, yes you did." Reema's voice was gentle but firm. "For a few weeks you meant it completely. You were ashamed of me, ashamed of where we came from, ashamed of the life we had built together. That's what money did to you, Sarah. It didn't reveal something new. It revealed something that was already there waiting." The truth of those words cut deeper than any anger could have. Sarah had been ashamed, had seen Reema as an obstacle to her new identity, rather than the foundation that had made everything possible. "I was wrong," Sarah said through her tears. "I was so wrong about everything. I don't know how to fix what I broke." Reema leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Do you want to fix it because you lost your money? Or do you want to fix it because you finally understand what you threw away?" The question hung in the air between them, and Sarah realized it was the most important question she would ever be asked. She thought about the past few days, about the hollow feeling of losing her wealth, about the deeper agony of realizing she had betrayed the person who mattered most. "I want to fix it because I finally understand," Sarah said quietly. "Money didn't change me, Grandma. It just showed me who I really was underneath all the gratitude I thought I felt. And I didn't like what I saw." Reema's expression softened slightly. "That's a start, sweetheart. But understanding isn't the same as changing. Understanding is easy when you've lost everything and need forgiveness. The real test is what you do when things get better. When you have choices again." Sarah nodded, knowing her grandmother was right. "Will you let me try? Will you give me the chance to prove I can be better than who I was?" Reema reached across the space between them and took Sarah's hands in her own weathered hands. "Oh, my dear girl, I never stopped hoping you'd find your way back to yourself. But this time we rebuild slowly. This time we build something real." For the first time in months, Sarah felt the beginning of peace. Not the false confidence that money had given her, but the quiet certainty that came from being known and loved despite your worst mistakes. It would be a long road back to trust, back to the relationship they had once shared. But for the first time since inheriting her grandfather's fortune, Sarah Williams felt like she was finally coming home. The apartment Sarah found was a far cry from the mansion in Riverside Heights, a one-bedroom unit in a converted downtown building where artists and graduate students lived alongside retirees on fixed incomes. The rent consumed most of her remaining funds, but it was honest shelter, the kind of place where no one pretended to be more than they were. "It's perfect," Reema said when Sarah showed her the small space, and her grandmother's approval meant more than any real estate agent's praise ever had. Sarah had sold most of her expensive belongings, the designer clothes, the jewelry, the artwork that had never really belonged to her anyway. The rest went to option, the proceeds helping to pay off the debts that Marcus schemes had created. Finding work proved humbling in ways Sarah hadn't expected. Her MBA and brief taste of wealth had left her overqualified for most entry-level positions, but underexperienced for roles that matched her education. After 3 weeks of rejections, she swallowed her pride and took a job at a non-profit housing organization, earning barely enough to cover her rent, but finding unexpected satisfaction in helping families navigate the complexities of affordable housing applications. "It's honest work," David Williams said when Sarah told him about the job over coffee. "Your grandfather would have understood that even if he forgot it himself for a while." David had become a bridge between Sarah and Reema, facilitating family dinners where they slowly rebuilt the trust that Sarah's betrayal had shattered. These meals were quiet affairs at first, careful conversations where every word was weighed for sincerity. "How is Mrs. Martinez?" Sarah asked during one dinner, inquiring about Reema's former employer at the alterations shop. "As well. She asks about you sometimes," Reema replied. She remembered how you used to help with the customer database when you were in high school. Sarah felt a flush of shame. "I was so dismissive of her kindness when I thought I was above that kind of work." "Mrs. Martinez understands pride," Reema said gently. "She's seen it in many young people who think they're too good for honest labor. The wise ones learn better eventually." Slowly, carefully, they began to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than obligation. Sarah visited Reema twice a week, not because she felt she should, but because she genuinely wanted to hear about her days, her opinions, her memories of the life they had shared before money complicated everything. The breakthrough came during Sarah's third month at the housing nonprofit, when Reema offered to help with the organization's holiday clothing drive. Sarah watched her grandmother sort donations with the same careful attention she had once given to alterations, treating each garment as if it belonged to someone she cared about. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read her grandfather's growing understanding of what he had thrown away and his desperate hope that she might prove wiser than he had been. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah opened the door to find Marcus Webb standing on her porch, looking older and more weathered than she remembered. Her first instinct was anger, but it was quickly replaced by something closer to pity. "Hello, Sarah. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see. What do you want, Marcus?" He held up his hands, showing he meant no harm. "I want to apologize and to return what I can." He handed her a cashier's check for $3 million. "It's not everything I took from you, but it's what I was able to recover from the legitimate investments before the authorities froze my assets." Sarah stared at the check, remembering how such an amount would have once seemed like salvation. Now it felt like a footnote to a more important story. "I read about your foundation," Marcus continued, "about what you've built with your grandmother. I wanted you to know that watching you lose everything and then build something real, it taught me something I thought I was too old and too corrupt to learn, which is that there's a difference between being rich and being wealthy. I spent 30 years helping rich people get richer, and I never met anyone who was actually wealthy until I watched you choose your grandmother over everything else." Sarah studied his face, looking for the manipulation she had once been so susceptible to. But Marcus seemed genuinely different, humbled in a way that money had never been able to accomplish. "What are you doing now?" "Community service, mostly part of my plea agreement, but I've kept doing it after my sentence ended. Working with people who've been victims of financial fraud, trying to help them rebuild what people like me destroyed." Sarah made a decision that would have been impossible for the person she used to be. "Would you like to come to dinner? Reema always cooks too much on Sundays, and she believes in second chances." Marcus' eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve that kindness." "None of us deserve the kindness we receive," Sarah said, echoing words Reema had spoken to her during their own reconciliation. "But that's what makes it kindness." The Sunday dinner that followed was awkward at first, but Reema's gift for making people feel human worked its magic on Marcus, as it had on so many others. By the end of the evening, he was sharing stories about his childhood, about the pressures that had led him to prioritize money over integrity, about the loneliness of a life built on manipulation and greed. "You could work with the foundation," Sarah found herself suggesting as Marcus prepared to leave. "We need someone who understands how financial predators operate. Someone who can help protect vulnerable people from the kind of schemes you used to run. You would trust me with that?" "I would trust Reema's judgment about whether you're ready for that trust," Sarah replied. "She's a better judge of character than I am." As months passed, Marcus proved himself reliable and genuinely committed to making amends. He developed financial literacy programs for the foundation, taught workshops on recognizing investment scams, and worked tirelessly to protect others from the kind of predatory schemes he had once perpetrated. "People can change," Reema observed one evening as they watched Marcus patiently explain compound interest to a group of first-time home buyers. "But only if they really want to, and only if someone believes they can." The foundation's 5th anniversary celebration was held not in the community center, but in the neighborhood park with booths representing each program and families bringing dishes to share. Sarah watched hundreds of people who had been touched by the foundation's work, former participants who had become mentors, donors who had become volunteers, community members who had found not just assistance but belonging. David Williams approached with his wife and teenage daughters, all of whom had become regular volunteers. "Remember when you thought wealth was about having more than other people?" he asked Sarah with a smile. "Now I think wealth is about making sure other people have enough," Sarah replied, watching Reema teach his daughters how to properly hem a dress. As the sun set over the celebration, Sarah found herself standing with Elena Morrison at the edge of the festivities, watching the community they had helped nurture. "Your grandfather would be amazed," Elena said, "not just by what you've accomplished but by who you've become." The woman who inherited $60 million was intelligent and ambitious, but fundamentally selfish. The woman standing here now understands that true wealth multiplies when it's shared. "I had to lose everything to learn that," Sarah replied. "Maybe that was always the point." Perhaps. But the real test wasn't whether you could lose money gracefully. It was whether you could gain it back without losing yourself again. Sarah looked around at the celebration, at Reema laughing with Maria Santos and her children, at Marcus explaining investment basics to young couples, at David's daughters proudly showing off their sewing projects. This was wealth in its truest form. A community of people who supported each other, who had learned that helping others was the most reliable path to helping themselves. "I keep expecting to feel the old temptations," Sarah admitted to Elena. "To want the status and recognition that money can buy. But honestly, I can't imagine anything more satisfying than this." "That's how you know the lesson took," Elena said with a smile. "True change isn't about resisting temptation. It's about no longer being tempted by things that don't actually satisfy." As the evening wound down and people began to clean up, Sarah found herself working alongside community members to pack up supplies and stack chairs. These simple tasks, which she once would have seen as beneath her, now felt like the most natural thing in the world. Sarah called Mrs. Rodriguez, now 84 and still Reema's closest friend. "Helped me carry this cooler to my car." "Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez." As they walked across the park, Mrs. Rodriguez studied Sarah's face in the lamplight. "You know, I was very angry with you for a long time. What you did to Reema nearly broke her heart. No. I was angry with myself too. But watching you these past 5 years, seeing how you've grown, I think maybe it was necessary. Maybe you had to become someone worthy of the love she had always given you." Sarah considered this as they loaded the cooler into Mrs. Rodriguez's car. "Do you think people can really change, or do they just become who they always had the potential to be?" "I think," Mrs. Rodriguez said thoughtfully, "that becoming who you have the potential to be is the definition of real change. Most people never bother to find out who that person might be." Driving home that night with Reema dozing peacefully in the passenger seat, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The inheritance that once seemed like a gift from nowhere now felt like the natural result of choices made over years of rebuilding trust and rediscovering love. "Grandma," she said softly, not wanting to fully awaken her. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Reema's eyes opened slightly. "Thank you for finding your way back to yourself, sweetheart. That's all I ever wanted, for you to become the person I always knew you could be." As they pulled into their driveway, Sarah looked at their house, comfortable, but not ostentatious, large enough for both of them to have privacy, but designed for togetherness. The lights were on in the living room where they would spend the evening, as they always did on Sundays, sharing tea and talking about the week ahead. This was wealth in its truest form. A home filled with love, work that made a difference, relationships built on authenticity rather than advantage. Sarah had learned the difference between having everything and having enough, between being rich and being wealthy, between deserving love and earning it. The inheritance that once seemed like a threat to destroy their family had ultimately strengthened it. But only after teaching them both what they were willing to sacrifice for each other and what they would never sacrifice again. As they walked toward their front door together, Sarah realized that her grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the money he left behind. It had been the hard-won wisdom that some things, once lost, become even more precious when found again. Epilogue 10 years later. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to the foundation's main office. Sarah recognized the letterhead immediately, though Elena had retired several years earlier. Inside was a packet of documents and a note from Elena's successor, Ms. Williams. Elena Morrison asked me to deliver this to you on the 10th anniversary of your grandfather's inheritance. She said you would understand its significance. The documents revealed the final secret Richard Blackwood had embedded in his estate planning, a trust fund separate from the inheritance designed to ensure the foundation's work could continue in perpetuity. But more than that, it contained provisions for Sarah's own family, children she didn't yet have, grandchildren she might never meet, a legacy built on the wisdom to use it well. The final document was a letter from Elena written before her retirement. Dear Sarah, if you are reading this, it means you have successfully navigated 10 years of true wealth. Your grandfather always believed that money was just a tool. But like any tool, it could build or destroy depending on the hands that wielded it. You have chosen to build. The foundation will outlive us all. But more importantly, the principles you've established, that wealth is measured in strengthened communities, that love multiplies when shared, that true inheritance passes wisdom rather than just money. These principles will shape generations of your family yet to come. Your grandfather failed his family but saved yours. That is the most precious legacy any ancestor can leave. Sarah sat in her office surrounded by the photographs that documented the foundation's growth. Ribbon cutings for new community centers, graduation ceremonies for job training programs, family photos from housing assistance recipients who had become homeowners. But the picture that drew her eye was the simple one on her desk. Herself and Reema, taken just last week at Reema's 86th birthday celebration. Both of them laughing at some joke David had made. Through her office window, she could see the newest addition to their campus, the Reema Jones Center for Intergenerational Wisdom, where seniors and young people work together on everything from financial literacy to traditional crafts. It was Reema's idea, born from her observation that young people need to learn from old mistakes and old people need to learn from young dreams. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Reema. Don't forget Marcus is making dinner tonight. He's trying that new recipe he learned from Maria's grandmother. Sarah smiled, thinking about how their unconventional family had grown to include the most unlikely members, Marcus, now the foundation's director of financial education, and Reema's devoted friend, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had moved in with them the previous year when her health began to decline. David's daughters, now college graduates who spent their summers working as foundation interns. As she prepared to leave the office, Sarah's assistant knocked on the door. There's someone here to see you. Says she's a reporter working on a story about inherited wealth and family relationships. Sarah sighed. Even after 10 years, journalists occasionally showed up wanting to write about her inspiring transformation or redemption story. She usually declined these interviews, uncomfortable with being portrayed as some kind of hero when she had simply learned to be a decent human being. Tell her I'm not available for interviews, but she's welcome to tour the programs and speak with participants. Actually, her assistant said with a smile, I think you'll want to meet this one. She says she's Richard Blackwood's great-granddaughter. Sarah's heart stopped. His what? Apparently, your grandfather had another son. This woman's grandmother was disowned 60 years ago for marrying outside their social class. She just found out about the foundation and wanted to meet you. The young woman waiting in the reception area was perhaps 25, with the kind of nervous energy Sarah remembered from her own youth. She stood when Sarah entered, extending her hand with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. Miss Williams, I'm Jessica Chen. I think we might be cousins. And so the story continued, Sarah realized, looking into eyes that reminded her startlingly of her grandfather's portrait. Wealth, family, love, loss, redemption. The same themes playing out in new lives, offering new chances to choose love over pride, connection over isolation, wisdom over mere accumulation. I'd like you to meet my grandmother, Sarah said, taking Jessica's arm. She has some things to teach you about what family really means. As they walked toward home together, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction of a story coming full circle. Her grandfather's money was meant to test her, but more than that, It had been meant to teach her that the most valuable inheritance wasn't what you received. It was what you learned to give. The sun was setting over their neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. In a few hours, they would all gather around the dinner table. Reema, Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus, David's family, and now Jessica. This unexpected addition to their complicated chosen family. Sarah pulled out her phone and called ahead. "Grandma, set another place for dinner. We have a new family member to meet." Through the phone, she could hear the warmth in Reema's voice. "There's always room for one more, sweetheart. That's what family means." Walking toward home with her newly discovered cousin, Sarah Williams understood that she had finally learned the lesson her grandfather had spent his fortune trying to teach her. That true wealth wasn't about what you could afford to buy, but what you could never afford to lose. And what she could never afford to lose. Love, family, community, the bonds that made life worth living. Those things had been hers all along, waiting to be recognized, cherished, and shared with anyone wise enough to understand their value. The inheritance was complete. The real wealth would last forever. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Blackwood Family Foundation's newest facility, casting long shadows across the conference room where Sarah Williams sat reviewing the quarterly impact reports. At 43, she had grown into the kind of leader her younger self could never have imagined. Calm, thoughtful, more interested in listening than speaking, more concerned with substance than appearance. "The numbers are remarkable," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh. Now the Foundation's executive director. 12,000 families housed, 8,000 people employed through our job training programs, and a 93% success rate for program graduates remaining stably employed after 2 years. Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to the personal stories behind the statistics. Each number represented someone like Maria Santos, who had grown her catering business into a restaurant chain that employed over 60 people, many of them Foundation program graduates, or like Marcus Webb, whose financial fraud prevention workshops had protected thousands of vulnerable individuals from predatory schemes. "The real measure," Sarah said quietly, "is in the stories they tell their grandchildren. Whether they pass on hope or despair, wisdom or bitterness, love or fear." Reema, now 91 and officially retired, but unofficially still the Foundation's most trusted advisor, looked up from the needlepoint she was working on during the meeting. Her hands moved more slowly than they once had, but her mind remained sharp as ever. "Sarah's right," Reema said, her voice still carrying the gentle authority that had guided Sarah through her darkest moments. "We're not just changing circumstances. We're changing what people believe is possible for their families." The meeting was interrupted by Sarah's assistant, who knocked apologetically on the conference room door. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who insists on seeing you immediately. She says it's about Richard Blackwood's will." Sarah and Reema exchanged glances. It had been over a decade since anyone had contacted them about her grandfather's estate. Elena Morrison had passed away 5 years earlier, and all legal matters had been settled long ago. "Send her in," Sarah said, curious despite herself. The woman who entered was perhaps 60, impeccably dressed in the kind of understated luxury that spoke of old money and refined taste. She moved with confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. But Sarah noticed a tension around her eyes that suggested this visit wasn't routine. "Miss Williams, my name is Catherine Blackwood Sterling. I'm your grandfather's eldest daughter." Sarah stared at the documents, her mind racing. 200 million more. With conditions. Of course, the money can only be used to provide reparations to families harmed by Blackwood Properties business practices, to fund programs for families torn apart by wealth disparity, and to create systems that prevent the kind of family destruction our father specialized in. Rama spoke for the first time since Catherine's arrival. "And you, what do you want out of this?" Catherine's composure cracked slightly. "I want to know if my niece," she looked at Sarah, "has learned what it took me 40 years to understand, that family isn't just about blood or money or tradition. It's about showing up for each other, especially when it's difficult." "I don't understand," Sarah said. "I have a daughter, Sarah, your cousin. She's been struggling with addiction for the past 5 years, and she needs help. Not the kind that money alone can provide, but the kind that comes from a community that believes in second chances, the kind your foundation claims to offer. Catherine's voice began to break. I've watched from a distance as you built something beautiful from the wreckage our father left behind. I've seen how you brought Marcus Webb back from the brink. How you've created opportunities for thousands of people to rebuild their lives. But I need to know, can you extend that same grace to family? Can you help someone whose last name carries the same burden yours once did? Sarah felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was another test, she realized, not from her grandfather this time, but from life itself. The choice between self-protection and radical compassion, between maintaining the careful world she had built and opening it to new complexity and risk. Tell me about your daughter, Sarah said quietly. Catherine's composure completely crumpled now. Her name is Rachel. She's 35, brilliant, broken. She was a pediatric surgeon before the addiction took hold. Lost her medical license, her home, her marriage. She's been in and out of treatment programs for years, but nothing's worked because she can't forgive herself for the lives she might have saved if she hadn't fallen apart. Sarah looked at Reema, seeing in her grandmother's eyes the same mixture of concern and compassion that had guided them through every difficult decision for the past 15 years. Bring her here, Sarah said simply. Not to fix her, we can't do that. But to offer her what was offered to me when I lost everything. A community that believes people can change, work that gives life meaning, and family that doesn't give up. Catherine's tears flowed freely now. You would do that after everything our family put yours through. Our family, Sarah corrected gently. We're all Blackwoods, all carriers of the same inheritance of pain and privilege. The only way to heal generational trauma is to stop passing it on. The integration of Rachel Blackwood Sterling into their community wasn't easy. She arrived 3 weeks later, hollow-eyed and skeptical, carrying the weight of her failures like a physical burden. Sarah recognized the look. It was the same expression she had worn when she first came crying to Reema's door, broken by her own choices and desperate for redemption she wasn't sure she deserved. Rachel's medical background made her valuable to the Foundation's health and wellness programs, but her emotional wounds ran deeper than professional expertise could heal. She struggled with the humility required to accept help, with the patience needed for genuine recovery, with the faith necessary to believe that change was possible. It was Rama who finally broke through Rachel's defenses, not through confrontation or therapy, but through the simple act of teaching her to bake bread. Bread is honest, Reema explained as they worked together in the community sense kitchen. It doesn't lie about what you put into it. If you're impatient, it shows. If you're careless, it shows. But if you're willing to do the work, to wait for the rising, to trust the process, bread rewards that faith. Sarah watched from the doorway as her 91-year-old grandmother patiently guided her newly discovered cousin through the ancient ritual of kneading dough. Rachel's hands, which had once performed delicate surgeries, now learned a different kind of healing, the therapeutic repetition of folding and pressing, the meditative rhythm of creation rather than crisis. She reminds me of you, Rama said to Sarah later that evening as they sat in their living room now adapted for Reema's increasing mobility needs, but still the heart of their home. So angry at herself, so convinced she's beyond redemption. Do you think she'll make it? Sarah asked. I think she'll make it because she has what you had. People who refuse to give up on her, work that matters, and time to remember who she was before she got lost. The changes in Rachel were gradual but unmistakable. She began volunteering in the Foundation's health clinic, providing medical care to uninsured families. Her hands, steady despite years of substance abuse, remembered their skills. More importantly, her heart began to remember its purpose. 6 months after her arrival, Rachel approached Sarah with a proposal. I want to create a program for healthcare professionals struggling with addiction. Doctors, nurses, therapists. We have one of the highest suicide rates of any profession because we're supposed to heal others, but we can't admit when we need healing ourselves. Sarah studied the detailed proposal Rachel had prepared. It was thorough, thoughtful, addressing gaps in the healthcare systems that she had never considered. This would require significant funding, specialized staff, partnerships with medical boards and licensing agencies. It's complicated, The best healing usually is, Rachel replied. But I know this community. I know it can hold complexity, can support people through long, messy recovery processes. I've lived it. The Healthcare Professional Recovery Program launched 18 months later, becoming one of the most successful initiatives. Rachel's combination of medical expertise and personal experience with addiction made her uniquely qualified to help others navigate the shame and professional consequences that often prevented healthcare workers from seeking help. The program's success caught national attention, leading to speaking engagements, media interviews, and policy consultations. Rachel handled the attention with grace, always redirecting credit to the community that had supported her recovery and the Foundation's philosophy that healing happened in relationship, not isolation. On the program's second anniversary, Sarah stood before a crowd of donors, program participants, and community members in the main auditorium of the Foundation's campus. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by the work they had built together. Former participants who had become mentors. Volunteers who had found purpose. Families who had been reunited and strengthened. But Sarah's eyes kept drifting to the front row where Reema sat in her wheelchair, now requiring assistance for mobility, but still mentally sharp and emotionally present. At 93, her grandmother had become a living symbol of the Foundation's core principle. That love multiplied when shared, that wisdom gained value when passed on. That the most important inheritance was the knowledge of how to build family rather than destroy it. 15 years ago, Sarah began her speech. I thought I knew what wealth looked like. I thought it was about having more than others, about being recognized and respected, about never having to worry about money again. She paused, looking out at the audience that included Catherine and Rachel, Marcus and Mrs. Rodriguez, David Williams, and his now adult daughters, Maria Santos, and dozens of other program graduates who had become community leaders. I was wrong about almost everything. Real wealth isn't about what you can afford to buy. It's about what you can't afford to lose. It's not about being superior to others. It's about lifting others up. It's not about accumulating resources. It's about sharing them wisely. The applause was warm but brief. This audience was more interested in substance than ceremony, more moved by authentic connection than polished performance. Today, I'm announcing the largest expansion in our Foundation's history. Thanks to provisions in my grandfather's will that I only recently learned about, we'll be opening branches in 25 cities over the next 5 years. But more importantly, we'll be launching the Generational Healing Initiative, a program designed specifically to help families recover from the damage caused by wealth inequality, addiction, abandonment, and intergenerational trauma. Sarah's voice caught slightly as she continued. This initiative exists because my grandmother taught me that healing happens in circles, not straight lines. That forgiveness is something you practice, not something you achieve. That family is something you build through daily choices, not something you inherit through DNA. After the formal program ended, Sarah found herself in the quiet of the memorial garden that had been created in Elena Morrison's honor. The space was designed for reflection with benches arranged around a fountain and pathways lined with plants that bloomed in different seasons, ensuring year-round beauty. Reema's wheelchair navigated the smooth paths easily, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" Reema asked, using the endearment that had anchored Sarah through every triumph and crisis of the past 15 years. Sarah considered the question seriously. Happiness felt like too simple a word for the deep satisfaction she experienced. The sense of purpose that guided her days. The knowledge that her work mattered to people she cared about. "I'm grateful," she said finally. "Grateful for second chances, for the family we've built, for work that feels meaningful. Grateful that losing everything taught me what I couldn't afford to lose." Reema reached over and took Sarah's hand in her own weathered one. "Your grandfather would be proud, not just of what you've accomplished, but of who you've become. He spent his whole life trying to control how he'd be remembered. You've learned that the only legacy that matters is the one you create through love." As the sun set over the Foundation campus, Sarah thought about the hundreds of people who would sleep safely tonight because of programs they had funded, the families who had been reunited through their counseling services, the communities that had been strengthened by their investment in local leadership development. But mostly she thought about the 93-year-old woman beside her, who had shown her that the most valuable inheritance wasn't money or property or status. It was the knowledge of how to love unconditionally, how to forgive completely, and how to build something beautiful from whatever pieces life left you with. Ready to go home? Sarah asked as the garden solar lights began to illuminate the pathways. I am home, Reema replied, squeezing Sarah's hand. Anywhere we're together is home. They made their way slowly back toward the building where Marcus was waiting with a car to drive them to the house they shared with Mrs. Rodriguez and Rachel. A house filled with laughter and conversation, with the comfortable chaos of a family that had been chosen rather than assigned, built rather than inherited. As they drove through the neighborhoods the foundation served, past the community centers and housing developments and small businesses that had grown from their investment in human potential, Sarah understood that her grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the money he left behind. It had been the opportunity to learn that true wealth was measured not in what you accumulated, but in what you gave away. Not in what you possessed, but in what you made possible for others. And not in what you inherited, but in what you chose to pass on. The circle was complete, but the story continued in every family reunited, every life transformed, every community strengthened by the knowledge that some things once lost could indeed be found again. And in the quiet house where 4 generations of chosen family would gather around the dinner table that night, sharing food and stories and the kind of love that money couldn't buy but wisdom could cultivate. The most important inheritance of all lived on. 5 years later, the funeral was unlike any memorial service Sarah had ever attended. Rather than a somber gathering in a traditional chapel, it was a celebration of life held in the foundation's main auditorium, with the overflow crowd watching via video link from locations across the campus and around the world. Reema Jones had died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 101, surrounded by the family she had loved into existence through decades of patient devotion and unconditional acceptance. Her passing marked the end of an era, but also the culmination of a legacy that would continue shaping lives for generations to come. Sarah stood at the podium looking out at nearly 2,000 people who had gathered to honor her grandmother's memory. The audience included foundation staff and program participants, community leaders and policymakers, families who had received reparations through the Generational Healing Initiative, and representatives from the dozens of organizations that had adopted the Foundation's community-centered approach to social change. Reema Jones was not a wealthy woman by conventional standards. Sarah began, her voice steady despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. She never owned property, never invested in the stock market, never accumulated the kind of assets that appear in financial magazines. She paused, gathering strength from the faces before her. People whose lives had been touched by Reema's wisdom, generosity, and unwavering belief in human potential. She was the wealthiest person I've ever known because she understood that true wealth is measured not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away, not in what you inherit, but in what you pass on, not in what you own, but in what you make possible for others. The stories shared during the memorial service painted a picture of a woman whose influence had extended far beyond her official role at the foundation. Rachel spoke about the bread baking lessons that had taught her patience and faith during her recovery. Marcus described the financial wisdom Reema had shared, advice that had helped him rebuild his life on principles of service rather than exploitation. Catherine talked about the family reconciliation work that had been inspired by Reema's example of loving across generations and despite past hurt. But it was James Washington who traveled from Mississippi to share perhaps the most powerful testimony. He spoke about visiting the foundation 3 years earlier, bringing his teenage grandson to see the place where their family's reparations had originated. Mrs. Jones spent an hour with my grandson, James said, his voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. She told him stories about resilience, about how families survive hardship by holding on to love and hope in each other. When we left, my grandson said it was the first time he understood that being poor didn't mean being powerless, that having money taken from your family didn't mean having dignity taken too. As the memorial service concluded, Sarah found herself thinking about the final conversation she had shared with Reema just weeks before her death. Despite her physical frailty, her grandmother's mind had remained sharp, and she had used their last lucid moments together to offer guidance about the future. "The foundation doesn't need me anymore," Reema had said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has grown beyond what any one person can control or direct. That's how you know it's built right, when it can continue growing without its founders." She had paused, gathering energy for what she clearly considered important words. "But you still need to remember what we learned together, Sarah. That healing happens in relationship. That money is a tool, not a purpose. That family is something you build through daily choices, not something you inherit through DNA." Now, standing in the memorial garden where Reema's ashes would be scattered among the plants she had helped design and tend, Sarah felt the weight of carrying forward alone a legacy they had built together. But as she looked around at the people gathering for the informal reception, at Rachel organizing food distribution with the efficiency she had learned managing addiction recovery programs, at Marcus patiently explaining investment principles to young adults preparing for financial independence, at Catherine facilitating conversations between families still working through reconciliation processes, Sarah realized she wasn't alone at all. Reema's true inheritance lived in every person who had learned to see family as something you created rather than something you endured. Wealth as something you shared rather than something you hoarded. Healing as something you participated in rather than something you waited to receive. The Blackwood Foundation would continue expanding, reaching new communities, developing innovative approaches to systemic change. The Generational Healing Initiative would serve as a model for reparative justice efforts around the world. The programs they had created would evolve and multiply, touching lives in ways they could never fully measure or predict. But the real legacy, the knowledge of how to love unconditionally, how to forgive completely, how to build something beautiful from whatever pieces life left you with, that inheritance would live forever in the hearts and choices of everyone who had learned from a 90-year-old seamstress who understood wealth in its deepest sense, that some things money can't buy but wisdom can cultivate. As the sun set over the foundation campus on the day they said goodbye to Reema Jones, Sarah Williams understood that her grandmother's greatest gift hadn't been the unconditional love she had provided, precious as that was. It had been the example she had set of how to transform any circumstance, poverty or wealth, loss or abundance, isolation or community, into an opportunity to create something meaningful for the people you love. The inheritance was complete. The real wealth would last forever. And somewhere in the evening air carried on the laughter of children playing in the community gardens and the conversations of families planning better futures. Reema's voice seemed to whisper the words that had guided Sarah through every triumph and crisis of the past 25 years. "That's what family means, sweetheart. There's always room for one more." Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.